Dennis Rader dubbed himself the BTK Killer. He did this because he murdered 10 people across Middle America in a 10-20 year period. And the key thing that he wanted from this was notoriety. But he didn't want to be identified. What he wanted was to be this shadowy but well-known figure that rose again to the top of the serial killer hierarchy. And to do this, he wasn't satisfied with the name that the media would give him. Instead of that, he tried different names on for size and brought them to the media, who he hoped would be fascinated by what it was he was doing. But where did it all begin? I'm Paul Britton. I'm a consultant psychologist. I brought psychological profiling, as it's now called, to the UK many years ago. I have worked on so many different murders and rapes that it makes your heart go cold sometimes. He did not want to accept personal responsibility. He wanted acclaim for his achievements, but he wanted to offset the wickedness that underpins so much of what he'd done. So rather than say, I decided that I was going to do this, kill somebody, hurt somebody, what he would do is he would create the notion of another part of himself. Now, some people would think in terms of split personalities and so on. In this case, that's complete nonsense. He created what he called the Minotaur. The Minotaur, of course, is a half bull, half human creature from Cretan mythology, Greek mythology. And it was a lethal beast that lived in a labyrinth. And the thing about it is that it was powerful. In the end, of course, it was brought down. But what Rader wanted to do is say that somehow this creature is something he had had access to, and it's not clear whether he was possessed by it or drawn to it, but he felt that its power and its appetites was something that came to him and was then responsible for the bad, the dark behavior. It's not true. In his case, we go back to his childhood, and what we see there is a youngster who already shows signs of a narcissistic psychopathy. Why? Well, he felt that his parents, and his mother in particular, just wasn't giving him the attention that he merited. And he became bitter, and he became resentful, and he became certain that he wasn't getting his due. And so what he needed were two things. He needed firstly to take it out on other people, and secondly, he needed to become the creature, the person that he felt he should have been if only his mother had paid him more attention. And that's what he sought to do across the years. He used his growing deviant sexuality to try to become someone else. He began to cross-dress. He began to steal women's underwear. He began to dress in women's clothing and found that he could only become truly sexually aroused when in this form of dress. Now, I'm stretching a little here, but if we look at what we know today about transgender change, we didn't really have that properly fixed in our sights then. But this is a man who in some way would have preferred to be a woman. But he knew that he could never be the sort of woman that he would dream of. And that's not his fault. That's the woman's fault, as far as he's concerned. It would be a woman who had prevented him from becoming what it was that he wanted. And the secret is in that word becoming, because he wanted to be, and he expected to be transformed, to become something above mere mortality, to become a super person. And that's what that change would have brought about. And by taking, binding, torturing, and eventually killing these people, he thought that this would help him on his way. It would help the transformation. Well, of course, it did help a transformation. It helped a weakly prepared for life youngster to become a sadistic, cruel killer. But not just that, to become a killer who wanted acclamation and recognition from the media and the community that he felt he never got when he was a child. This is a person who went to the media to get the reinforcement that he wanted. And for a time it seemed to work, because he became quiet for a little period of time. But eventually the cross-dressing that he was doing, the enjoyment that he was getting from the photographs that he was taking, imagining himself to be a woman, wasn't enough. He needed people to be aware a little more of his greatness, and so he started writing his letters again. And he'd been writing his letters to the media and others over these years. And it was in this last episode of letter writing that his downfall came, because hidden in some of the materials he sent, investigators were able to find the address of a church that was the one that he used. And they were able to tie this to complaints that had been made about a particular person, him, for his activities in and around that church. Well, it didn't take very long from there for the investigators to go and look at him very seriously. And what happened? Very quickly, he not only is able to confess to the murders, but he expects to be elevated to the higher end of serial killers. When people look at killers that are similar to Rader, they will sometimes find them saying, this is a person who must have been born evil. Now, in my experience, I have come across people who I regard as being born evil very, very rarely. Most people gradually move from ordinary behaviour, from ordinary personalities, through a series of disruptions or setbacks, to increasingly come to adopt what we later come to think of as evil. And I think Rader is in this group. The key thing for him, it isn't his desire really to become different. It isn't really his desire to be noticed and cared for by his mother. It's his burning urge to be recognised, to have attention, to be seen as the great, in this case, serial killer. And all of the people along the way, although they gave sexual pleasure at the time, and sexual pleasure that he could not find anywhere else, they all accumulated in his journey to become famous, even if they were never to have a face to put to the fame. And right to the end, I think that's what he wanted. And it hasn't entirely worked out that way, but he did manage a fair bit. It's noteworthy that in this man's childhood, in his background, he indulged in behaviour that we see in the lives of other people who go on to be violent, sexual and murderous offenders. At his grandparents' farm, he used to take rabbits and hang them till they died. He used to become erotically aroused by being with and seeing chickens as they waited to be slaughtered. Now, this isn't fantasy. This is that bridge between the real world, something that is vulnerable, something that he knows is going to die, something that he can kill, he can test, he can experiment with. There's going to be no price for him to pay. It's warm, and he's going to kill it. He's going to feel it become soft and limp, and gradually it's going to become cold. These factors became locked into his arousal system. It became pleasurable for him. We see him then move on so that he works, I think, in a retail store where he's in the butchery department, where he would become very familiar with the use of knives. He would become expert to a level at the sense of the knife through flesh. It's something that he would go on to recreate in his different ways over the years. You can't minimize the extent. Two things. One, the way that he was drawn to this. He didn't have to do these things. He did it because he enjoyed it, because he liked it, because it gave him that frisson that nothing else did. And then you see how it's part of the bedrock that goes on to the torture and the killing that comes later. And remember, the first binding that he did wasn't a human being, it was the rabbit.